When it comes to God, we need to talk about sin. This may seem like a dreary topic to start with, but here's why I think it's important when discussing the Christian view of things. First of all, Christianity is about Jesus Christ. And according to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21, He came to save us from our sin. If we do not understand sin properly, we won't understand salvation properly. And if we do not understand salvation, we won't understand Jesus and the work that He's doing, and we therefore risk being lost forever. So I hope you can see that sin is actually foundational. If we get this wrong, everything else we build on top of it will be off center. To begin, we'll have a look at how sin entered our world. And we find this account recorded in Genesis chapter 3. Even many non-Christians are familiar with it. Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, that infamous tree, and the serpent. What I want to focus on is how our first parents fell into sin. I want to look at the logic or the rationale behind their decision, because as a youngster I struggled to find much sense in it. It seemed incredible to me that they could be deceived by the devil's words. Much later in life, when I was finally converted and became a real Christian, I actually started to study the Bible for myself. And I discovered that it makes a lot more sense than I used to think. I would like to share my observations with you, and hopefully it may shed some light on the topic for you too. So let's do it. Turn with me to verse 1 of Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. So first of all, if we're going to allow the Bible to speak for itself, we have to recognize that this was not a snake as we commonly know them. Apparently, they were the smartest creatures made. So the devil's chosen vessel was an animal that might have been more intelligent even than modern day monkeys. Keep this in mind as we proceed. The rest of the verse reads as follows. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? We need to observe two things. The devil is not questioning Eve's memory. He's questioning God's reason for saying it. Notice how he inverts the prohibition. God had said that they may eat of every single tree and avoid only one. How many trees could they possibly eat from? Who knows? Hundreds and possibly even thousands. But only one was off limits. The point is that it was a prohibition, but with lots of freedom. But the devil turned it around by placing the focus on one single, solitary boundary. He turned it from a prohibition of freedom into a prohibition of restriction. So instead of emphasizing that they may eat of every tree, he emphasized that there's one they may not eat from. And this is what the serpent leveraged to cast doubt on God's reason for making the prohibition. It's almost like saying, Did God really say you shouldn't eat of this tree? Would God really have said that? I wonder why God doesn't want you to eat from this tree. Can you see that God's motives, God's character is being called into question? The goal is for Adam and Eve to lose trust in God, to be suspicious of Him. Now let's go to verse 4. Then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die." At this point, Satan moves from speaking doubt to speaking a direct contradiction. He is, in fact, calling God a liar. And the enemy thus embarks on a campaign to slander God, to accuse him. Let's look at a dictionary definition of the word slander. Words spoken that damage the reputation of another. An abusive attack on a person's character or good name. To charge someone falsely or to charge with malicious intent. I would like to submit to you that this has been the devil's MO throughout the ages, even now. It may surprise you, but the devil is not necessarily out to kill you. You are of no use to him dead. But if he can get you to believe lies about God and reject him and use you as a tool to turn others away from God, well, that's more productive and satisfying, wouldn't you say? In verse 5, the serpent intensifies the distrust placed on God. He says, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." The serpent questioned God's motive, calling him a liar. And now he assigns malicious motive to God, because he's saying that God is withholding something good from them. The first implication of this is that God is ill-willed towards them. He wants to keep them from experiencing the supposed benefits of the forbidden tree. And the second implication is that God is selfish and insecure, because if eating from the tree could make Adam and Eve like God, then God's divine attributes may be attained. They are not intrinsic to God himself, and therefore God is not God by virtue of who or what he is, but because he attained that power. Quite possibly, he attained it from the very tree that he wants to keep them away from. In other words, he has an advantage over them and wants to selfishly keep it to himself, so that no one else may compete with him for the position of God. Do you see what the devil is tempting Adam and Eve with? First, he instills a feeling of discontent, and then he tempts them with ambition for power and authority. By the way, in this statement, Satan claimed that they would, quote unquote, know good and evil. What does this mean? Stay tuned, we'll get to this a little bit later. But first, let's examine verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. I want to draw your attention to the word saw. She saw some things, and seeing is a sensory perception. It means visual evidence. The Bible doesn't say that she thought or that she understood. It says that she saw. And she saw three things. Let's take a look. First, she saw that it was good for food. In other words, she saw that it was edible, as opposed to not edible. Well, how could she see that it was good for food? We only know whether something is edible or not based on our own experience, or based on knowledge passed on to us. Compare, for example, a coconut with tree bark. We know that a coconut is edible but not really tree bark. All based on knowledge that was passed on to us. Very few of us know this because we tried eating both. And yet, if you had no knowledge or experience with either of the two, you wouldn't be able to tell which is edible and which is not. Not by just looking at them. And it's the same in this case. Neither Adam nor Eve had ever eaten from this tree, nor did any other people pass knowledge on to them about the edibility of its fruit. So how did Eve know? Well, she saw. How did she see? The only inference is that she saw the serpent eating, and evidently the snake wasn't dying. That's how she saw the fruit was good for food. Well, alright. Let's move on to the second point. She saw that it was pleasant to the eyes. It appeared harmless. She didn't see anything wrong with it. Nothing about the situation looked apparently dangerous. And therein lies a lesson for us. Just because we don't see anything wrong with a particular choice we wish to make, doesn't mean it's innocent and harmless, and that it won't lead to disaster. We need to be very careful when we try to justify a chosen course of action by saying, I don't see what's wrong with it. Anyway, moving on to the third point. She saw that it was desirable to make one wise. Once again, I'd like to labor the point. She saw that it was desirable to make one wise. So how could she possibly see this? How could she see that the fruit would make her wise? Well, it's easy. She was having a conversation with a snake after all. If the serpent was eating the fruit, and not only not dying, but if it was also clearly talking with her, then it must have gained that ability from the fruit that it was eating. And surely if the fruit can do that for a snake, imagine what it might do for humans. Just an aside, the verse briefly mentions that Eve shared the forbidden fruit with Adam. It's the very nature of deception that when we ourselves are deceived, we go on to deceive others, either intentionally or unintentionally. But note, when we fall, we rarely go down alone. We take other people down with us. And this is why it's reckless, irresponsible, and even immoral to play around with sin. You and I are not islands, and your example and your influence, and of course your actions, it will affect someone else. Anyway, at this point, I hope you're starting to see some of the subtleties in the deception proffered by the devil in Genesis 3. It is a lot more compelling than it might appear at first, if you're doing merely a surface reading. Now, let's get back to the previous question. What does it mean, quote unquote, knowing good and evil? I used to think this means that they would know evil because they would experience it. They would know it by being evil. Kind of in the same way that they would know good because they experienced it by being good. But I don't think that's the best answer, because in verse 22 we read the following. Then the Lord said, Behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. God is the one who's speaking here. And do you notice that he says exactly what the devil said? In other words, when the devil told our first parents that they would be like God, insofar as they would know good and evil, he was actually telling the truth. And that is why my past impression cannot be true. Because in 1 John 1 and verse 5, we read that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. That is to say, God is not both good and evil. He does not know what it means to be evil in the same way he knows what it means to be good. I mean, he does not know good and evil experientially, like you and I do. But he does know good from evil. He is the moral monarch of the universe, the moral arbiter. Being all-knowing, he alone can know what is objectively good and objectively evil. So what Satan was effectively saying is that by eating the fruit, Adam and Eve would gain the ability to decide for themselves what is right and wrong. They could become moral monarchs, as it were, their own moral arbiters. But is that such a bad thing? We'll talk some more about this in just a minute. But on another side note, remember, the devil told the truth. So be very careful about who you believe. People who claim to be smart and or educated, or even people who are smart and or educated, are not necessarily trustworthy. Moreover, lies are compelling because they are always mixed with truth. If they weren't, we wouldn't have much reason to believe them. For example, if a man told me that I have won the lottery, I wouldn't be tempted to believe him, because I don't play the lottery. But if I did, perhaps it would be a different story. Now, at this point in the narrative, Adam and Eve harbored serious doubts about God's character. And doubt leads to distrust. In other words, they lost faith in God. So the original problem when we fell into sin was that we lost faith. Therefore, it makes sense that the solution to the sin problem would be to recover faith. And this is why we read so much about this, especially in the New Testament. Please do keep this in mind for future recordings. In the end, Eve and her husband decided, or you might say voted, against God. That forbidden tree was not an accident, neither was it an arbitrary or cruel test. It represented our freedom of choice. If we had chosen to trust God and resist temptation, we would have been saying yes to God. But by yielding to doubt and suspicion, we said no instead. Without the tree, without the opportunity to say no to God, our yes would be meaningless. Choosing for something or someone is only really meaningful if the freedom and opportunity exists to make a different choice. Now, here's the problem with choosing no. As created beings, we are contingent. That means all that we have is derived, it's borrowed. We have life and knowledge only because God has it and imparts it to us. Now, as contingent beings, we, unlike God, are imperfect. And as imperfect beings, we do not have perfect knowledge, and therefore we cannot be perfect moral arbiters. Neither can we see the future, so the ultimate consequences of any particular path are hidden from us. Having made the choice to follow a moral compass of our own making, God gave us over to the consequences of that choice. The compass was untrustworthy because it came from fallible minds. Trusting in and following its inaccurate directions, a fundamental shift took place in our nature. Instead of trusting God and from that position of trust, humbly depending on Him to inform our decision making, we now open the gates to a disposition of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, a door that once opened could not be shut. And this irrevocably predisposes us towards erroneous thinking, which ultimately results in evil. A cup of pure water mixed with poison is forever ruined, and likewise, the same happened to us. Think of it. Once you think something, you cannot unthink it, and once you do something, you cannot undo it. It has a bearing on your being that cannot be erased. We cannot trust our way out of a disposition to distrust. Trust is only regained once trustworthiness is re-established. Likewise, you cannot think your way out of erroneous thinking, since the very instrument of thinking is diseased. It's a catch-22 situation, you see. But tragic as it may have turned out, God permitted us to choose, and He could not protect us from the results of our choice, without, in the process, infringing upon that very freedom. So here is a summary of what we learned. The devil is an accuser. We tend to think that he accuses us, which is true, but often we fail to recognize that he accuses God. Accusing, telling lies, deceiving, and casting doubt, these form the basis of his MO. It has been, it is, and it ever will be his MO. We will probably expand on this in future recordings. Satan's strategy is to get us to doubt. And of course, doubt leads to distrust. He supported his case with convincing evidence that appealed to the senses. Nothing of the forbidden tree was intrinsically poisonous. It was a tangible way for us to exercise our God-given free will. Our decision was between trusting God or trusting ourselves instead. We decided to distrust and to choose self. But we are fallible, imperfect, and therefore we poisoned the well of our own moral faculties. We trapped ourselves in a cycle of distrust and erroneous thinking. God permitted the consequences to follow from our choice, even though it would lead to suffering, because God is love, and love has to allow for the freedom to not love. Now, at this point, there are still some loose ends that need to be addressed, but over time, possibly over many recordings, we will hopefully start filling in those gaps. For now, I want you to consider this. If you think or have ever thought that God's requirements are restrictive, that God is a great big party pooper, guess what? You've fallen for literally the oldest trick in the book. It's kind of like believing fake news about God. Maybe it's time for you to re-examine your perspective and to put God's way to the test. You won't be disappointed. I can guarantee it. Or rather, He does. Why not give it a shot? Next time, do we inherit sin and the guilt for sin from our ancestors? Stay tuned for our next episode. But until then, this is the Extraterrestrial Christian, bringing you interdimensional news.